Everyone remembers the heat itself, the record temperatures, the warnings to stay indoors, the images of people fanning themselves on public transport while the mercury climbed past levels most cities were never built to handle. But scientists studying what happens after a heat dome breaks are increasingly convinced that the heat is not actually the most dangerous part of the story. What comes next, they say, quietly and without the dramatic graphics, could end up doing far more damage than the heat itself ever did. To understand why, you first have to understand what a heat dome actually is. It is not simply a hot day. It is a stubborn ridge of high pressure that traps hot, dry, sinking air over a region and refuses to move, sometimes for a week or more at a time. Meteorologists describe this pattern as an atmospheric blocking event, and its defining feature is not intensity alone, but persistence. A normal hot spell passes through and clears out. A heat dome sits in place, baking the same ground, the same rivers, and the same infrastructure day after day until something eventually gives. That distinction matters, because it explains why the consequences do not end when the temperatures finally drop. Once a heat dome breaks and cooler air moves back in, scientists say the region underneath it has already absorbed weeks' worth of accumulated stress. Stress that does not simply reset the moment the thermometer reading returns to normal. It shows up instead in the water systems, the power grids, the forests, and the human body, often in ways that take much longer to become visible than the heat itself did. Start with water, because this is where researchers say some of the most serious, long-term consequences begin. Extended extreme heat accelerates evaporation dramatically, pulling moisture out of rivers, reservoirs, and soil far faster than normal seasonal patterns would predict. Hydrologists who study this have explained that a single intense heat dome can effectively compress months' worth of expected water loss into a matter of weeks, leaving reservoirs and groundwater systems in a deficit that an average autumn or winter often cannot fully repair before the next heat event arrives. When rivers run critically low, the effects cascade outward, disrupting everything from drinking water supplies to shipping routes to the cooling systems that power plants depend on. That last point, cooling systems, is one that catches a lot of people off guard. Several power plants, including nuclear facilities, rely on river or reservoir water to cool their reactors safely. When that water runs too low or gets too warm, from weeks of sustained heat, plant operators are sometimes forced to reduce output or shut down entirely to avoid violating safety and environmental limits. Engineers describe this as a genuinely uncomfortable irony, because the exact moment when electricity demand spikes hardest as millions of homes run air conditioning nonstop is also the moment when some of the most reliable sources of power generation are being forced offline by the very heat driving that demand. Wildfire risk is the next domino to fall, and it is often the most visible consequence once the heat dome itself has faded from headlines. Weeks of extreme dryness leave vegetation primed to ignite, and fire scientists explain that the danger frequently peaks not during the hottest days themselves, but in the dry, windy period immediately afterward, when humidity remains low and fuel moisture has been stripped away by the preceding heat. Fire agencies in multiple countries have had to issue red alerts for extreme fire danger in exactly this kind of aftermath window, sometimes even as public attention has already moved on to the next news story. There is an ecological cost, too, that researchers say is easy to underestimate. Sustained extreme heat accelerates something called evapotranspiration, the rate at which plants lose water into the atmosphere. When that process speeds up too quickly, forest researchers have documented rapid, widespread leaf loss and even the death of young, more vulnerable trees within days, damage that does not simply reverse once temperatures cool back down. Multiply that across an entire region's forests and farmland, and the ecological toll of a single heat dome can extend for seasons, not just days. Agriculture absorbs a similarly delayed impact. Farmers plan irrigation schedules and harvest timing around expected water availability, and when a heat dome disrupts that availability mid-season, the consequences do not always show up immediately. Crop yields can suffer in ways that only become fully visible at harvest, weeks or months after the heat itself has ended. Livestock face a more immediate version of the same problem, with sustained heat stress reducing milk production and, in severe cases, contributing directly to animal deaths on farms without adequate cooling infrastructure. If explanations like this, the parts of these stories that scientists actually worry about after the headlines fade, are useful to you, go ahead and like and subscribe so you catch the next one, because these patterns keep repeating almost every single year now. Public health researchers explain that the human cost follows a similarly delayed pattern. Official death tolls from heat events are notoriously undercounted in the immediate aftermath, because many fatalities among elderly people or those with pre-existing heart and respiratory conditions get attributed to those underlying conditions rather than the heat that pushed their bodies past a breaking point. Scientists studying past Heat events have found that official mortality figures are almost always revised upward, sometimes significantly, once complete excess mortality data becomes available months later. That means the true human toll of any given heat dome typically is not understood until long after the story has left the news cycle entirely. Infrastructure damage tells a similar story of delayed consequences. Roads buckle, rail. Lines warp, and in some cases, extended dry soil conditions following extreme heat have been linked to ground shrinkage that stresses buried pipes and even causes shifting in building foundations. None of this happens instantly during the hottest day of a heat wave. It accumulates gradually, the way a foundation cracks slowly under repeated stress, rather than failing all at once, which is exactly why the true cost is so often measured in the weeks and months following an event rather than during the event itself. Economists tracking the financial fallout from repeated heat domes point to a similar delayed accounting problem. Insurance and reinsurance companies that model climate-related risk have begun explicitly flagging the aftermath period, not just the heat itself, as a major driver of rising costs for property, agricultural, and business interruption coverage. Analysts explain that when the same pattern of extreme heat followed by water scarcity, wildfire risk, and infrastructure strain repeats year after year, insurers stop treating it as a rare exception and start pricing it in as a recurring baseline risk, a shift that ripples through everything from farm insurance premiums to municipal infrastructure budgets. What ties all of these threads together, scientists explain, is that a heat dome does not really end when the temperature drops. It transitions into a second, quieter phase that unfolds across water systems, power grids, forests, farmland, and public health data over the following weeks and months. That second phase rarely produces the same kind of dramatic footage a heat wave does. There is no obvious red graphic for a stressed aquifer or a delayed excess mortality report. But according to the researchers who study this closely, it is often that quiet second phase, not the visible heat itself, that ends up shaping how communities actually experience the true cost of a heat dome long after everyone has stopped talking about the temperature. Groundwater deserves particular attention in this explanation because it is often treated by the public as an unlimited backup system when surface water runs short during a heat dome. Scientists studying aquifer systems explain that this assumption is largely wrong. Aquifers depleted during past dry years in many regions still have not fully recovered. And every additional heat dome that pushes farmers and municipalities toward heavier groundwater pumping makes future recovery slower and, in some cases, permanently more difficult. Researchers have pointed out that some of this depletion may take decades of consistently above average rainfall to reverse, a timeline that does not align well with heat domes, now arriving on a near annual basis in several regions. There is also a behavioral and psychological dimension that researchers are only beginning to study in depth. Scientists explain that repeated exposure to extreme heat events appears to be reshaping how people plan daily life, from school and work schedules to how cities design public spaces. Urban planners in heat-affected regions have started treating heat resilience, things like reflective building materials, expanded shade and green space, and accessible cooling centers, as a core design requirement rather than an afterthought. These adaptations take years, sometimes decades, to fully implement, which means most cities experiencing repeated heat domes are still operating with infrastructure designed for a climate that no longer matches current reality on the ground. Energy grids illustrate this delayed reckoning especially clearly. Grid operators explain that the aftermath period following a heat dome often reveals infrastructure weaknesses that were not fully visible during the event itself. Transformers that overheated but did not fail outright, transmission lines operating closer to their thermal limits than expected, and backup power systems that were stretched thinner than planners anticipated. Utility companies increasingly conduct detailed post-event reviews, specifically to catch this kind of latent damage before the next heat spike arrives, because scientists studying grid resilience warn that cumulative, repeated stress on aging infrastructure can eventually lead to failures that have nothing directly to do with the heat of any single day, but everything to do with the accumulated toll of several heat domes stacking up over a season or a year. Historical comparison is part of what makes researchers describe this pattern as genuinely concerning rather than simply unfortunate. Climate scientists studying long-term temperature and drought records explain that events once considered once-in-a-generation outliers, extreme heat waves from decades past that were expected to be statistical rarities, are now being matched or exceeded within just a few years of each other in several regions. When a modern heat dome starts resembling or surpassing an event that was treated as historically extraordinary, and then a similar event follows again within the same decade, researchers say that pattern is treated as a meaningful signal about a changing baseline, not a coincidence. Emergency planners are already adjusting how they approach this aftermath period based on exactly this kind of explanation from scientists. rather than treating the weeks following a heat dome as a return to normal. Several regional planning agencies have begun building extended monitoring windows into their emergency response protocols, tracking water levels, grid performance, wildfire risk, and public health indicators for months after the heat itself has ended. Officials involved in this shift describe it as a recognition that the visible emergency and the actual risk period are no longer the same thing, and treating them as identical, scientists explain, is precisely what leaves communities unprepared for the slower moving consequences that follow. Researchers involved in this kind of extended monitoring say the goal is not to alarm the public unnecessarily, but simply to make sure that resources, attention, and funding do not disappear the moment the temperature graphics stop trending, since that is often exactly when the real work of managing the aftermath is only just beginning. Scientists who study these compounding effects year after year describe a simple but frustrating pattern. The public and the media move on almost immediately once temperatures drop, while the actual burden on water systems, power grids, farmland, and public health continues building quietly for weeks or months afterward, largely unnoticed by anyone outside the agencies directly responsible for managing it. So the next time a heat dome finally breaks and the headlines move on to the next story, do not assume the danger has passed with it. According to scientists who study these events closely, the heat itself is often just the opening chapter. What comes after, in the water systems, the power grids, the forests, and the slowly revised mortality statistics, is frequently the part of the story that ends up mattering most, even though almost nobody is watching it happen in real time.